Hi, everyone. This particular slideshow focuses on sovereignty, conquest, and colonization. These are three particular terms and ideologies that I think are very central to understanding, number one, the Native American experience in the United States, but number two, the experience of for that many immigrants faced in their home countries. And so make sure that you have a very clear understanding of each of these ideas. Towards the end of this slideshow, I'm going to talk about sovereignty and the establishment of sovereignty for Native American populations in the United States. So let's start first with the idea of conquest. Conquest is the subjugation and assumption of control of a place or people by use of military force. This can include domination, coercion, and control of a group of people in place through legal, social, political, and physical violence. When we talk about conquest, we can think about this from a more historical standpoint when you think about things like the Holy Roman Empire, in which the Roman armies essentially conquered different parts of the world, meaning that they, through military force, they took land and took control of different people. The key part of conquest is really understanding that there is this use of military force in which people against their will become subjects of either a nation or a king or a dictator. Next, we have imperialism. This is domination by one or more countries over others for political and economic objectives. So, in terms of imperialism, I think that what's important to note is that it can be affected by force of arms or through economic and political power exercised by state and corporate agencies. Now, the key part of this particular bullet point, this second bullet point here, is that it can be exercised by a country, which we can understand that when we talk about having economic and political power over one country over another, makes sense. But the second part, which involves corporate agencies, basically talks about the idea that there are particular companies that can exercise so much power over a country that it sort of dictates the outcomes of what's happening to its people. And I'm going to come back to that idea in just a second. Imperialism is sometimes organized in a formal empire. As I just talked about, there's the Holy Roman Empire with a ruling nation and colonized territories. Keep it in mind if we think about our young U.S. history, we had 13 colonies here. We were all colonized by England, in which we were often taxed and tasked with sending back resources to England in exchange for England's protection. Right, this is exactly what we rebelled against. And it can also exist where one nation or region exercises dominant influence over international trade and investment, patterns of economic development, and mass communication. So going back to this idea of imperialism, we know that, for example, in terms of the idea of a nation state having political power over another, we've talked historically about England having power over the United States. We can think about more contemporary examples in which the United States is the imperial power. So, for example, we can look at the United States in relationship to the Philippines, which we've talked about previously in terms of some of the readings for this class. The United States has had, for over 100 years, has had a military base in the Philippines that the U.S. Government, as when it colonized the Philippines, actually controlled and rebuilt things like its roads. It also was very influential in terms of who was winning elections. It was also very influential in actually reformatting and changing the entire education system in the Philippines. So much so that now one of the few countries that we actually accept credentials for things like nursing are from the Philippines because the U.S. built that education system there. Now, when we talk about corporate agencies, we can think about this in relationship to the United States and its influence in the Middle East. There are many different corporate agencies. For example, the owners of the gun company of SIG, right? Or also oil companies that really sort of dictate a very sort of powerful set of politics in the Middle East. So much so that the United States, which has economic interests there, will also be involved with making sure that these companies are protected overseas. So we can see the ways in which different corporate agencies can then dictate the governance of particular spaces, and that's part of imperialism. Then we have colonialism, right? This is political domination of one nation over another, institutionalized in direct political administration by the colonial power. The colonial power has control of all economic relationships, and it's also a systematic attempt to transform the culture of the subject nation. And it involves extensive immigration from the colonial power into the colony, and immigrants taking on roles as landowners, business people, and professionals. It is important to note that colonialism is a form of imperialism. And I think I've already sort of given you the example, but as we've already seen, we saw this in terms of the United States, that the colonists or the people who were coming from England often were coming to were coming to work on the lands. They took on jobs as mayors, as also lords and barons, right, as in the United States. So part of what's important to know about colonialism is that this is also about the fact that the dominating country sends their people over in order to oversee the administration of that nation state. So some argue that the rationalization for colonialism is sort of is grounded in sort of very sort of almost racist or unequal or sorry, rewind, is that colonialism, the rationalization for colonialism, is often deeply rooted in beliefs about inequality. So, for example, Ian Smith argued that I would say colonialism is a wonderful thing. It spread civilization to Africa. Before it, they had no written language, no wheel as we know it, no schools, no hospitals, not even normal clothing. End quote. So, historically, when they looked at colonization, it was this idea that they were actually helping society out, that somehow these groups were primitive, and therefore colonization or bringing sort of Western European or American influence to the space would actually help them progress. According to Foucault, it's a process linking groups together, extending their hold, honing their efficiency, and increasing their power. In other words, what Foucault argues is that it's not altruistic. It isn't just about helping people out, but in fact, it's actually linking groups of people together. And it's actually, we do this because we want to have greater power. This greater power can happen in the form of strengthening relationships, giving us a strategic military position, which is what we've seen in the Philippines, for example. It could also be about increasing our access to resources that we don't have readily available. So, in other words, what Foucault was saying is we need to be much more critical about how we understand colonialism and why it happens. So one thing I want you to think about is what are the consequences of conquest, colonization, and imperialism on subordinated groups of people. We've read a little bit about this before in our earlier readings on We Don't Sleep Around Like White Girls Do, and that part of what we want to think about is that it doesn't just happen and not have an impact on those who are colonized. Some have argued, researchers have argued that conquest and colonization impacts our understanding of self-image and identity. In other words, how we see ourselves. If you're a colonized group of people, how we see ourselves relative to power. Oftentimes, it can be very disempowering. And also, as we see in the reading by Espiritu, which is next week, I believe, is that it also impacts, it creates a struggle, particularly for second generation immigrants, in terms of do we take on the sort of attributes of the colonizing country, or do we stay true to our own culture? It also impacts how we understand decision making structures and leadership. So in some cases, as we've seen with Native American communities, which were often matrilineal and much more collective, it is often forced a form of leadership that's just much more top down, or it's created a way in which groups like Native Americans have had to try to transform how they think about leadership. Conquest and colonization also create a sense of entitlement, particularly for those who are the conquering forces, in terms of what they are due. So, for example, if you look at the history of the United States, part of what really created the American Revolution was the idea of taxation without representation. England felt that it had the right to tax all of its subjects, and that their subjects had no say in the matter, they had no voice. And so, part of what conquest and colonization can do is create a sense of entitlement for one group, but also at times means that in terms of taking responsibility, groups of people have to step up, just like the revolutionaries did against what they consider the tyranny of England. There's also this idea of a sense of community and community mortality. One of the things that we see for colonized groups is that that some band together in the face of oppression, but also sometimes they feel that their way of life can be threatened, that they're losing their sense of self, and this is a theme that we see. Also, we also have to understand that colonization and conquest is also about trying to build a nation's wealth and resources, and this is something that comes through in terms of the Dakota Access Pipeline, where it's very clear one of the major factors influencing the desire to push through this pipeline is less about caring about the Standing Rock Sioux and more about increasing the wealth of particular companies, namely the energy transfer partners. So, in terms of the impact of colonization, T.F. Hodge writes, when individuals and communities do not govern self, they risk being ruled by external forces that care less about the well being of the village. Part of what Hodge is getting at is that when you end up being colonized, that oftentimes what's lost is the sense of community, that that the sense of autonomy and the sense of being able to make decisions for yourself, this idea of agency, is lost, and as a result, this can lead to very detrimental outcomes for your community. When we think about historically where this has happened, we can look at when you look at a lot of studies that have been done on Native American wealth and health and wellness. Part of the argument is that as the U.S. government had forced Native American communities onto reservations, that part of what happened was this loss of well-being for the community. You had a loss of cultural practices. So, for example, through the Trail of Tears and then this subsequent stealing or taking of lands from the original reservations, part of what we began to see is that Native American tribes were unable to practice their own cultural practices. So, for example, many were hunters and gatherers, and others focused on the water and, in particular, fishing. And as they were unable to practice their own cultural systems that they had learned over centuries, we began to see deteriorating health rates. We saw also increased use of alcohol and drugs, and that there was an increase in kind of codependent disorders, co-occurring disorders, in which you saw mental health illnesses like depression coinciding with the use of drugs and alcohol. And so the impact of colonization is not just about this loss of land; it's also about this loss of identity. And with that loss of identity comes a loss of overall health and well-being. Now, I want to spend the next few slides just focusing very specifically on Native Americans in the U.S. because their particular relationship with the United States differs from other racial and ethnic groups. So, in the United States, the federal government has special trust obligations to protect tribal lands and resources, protect tribal rights to self-government, and provide services necessary for tribal survival and advancement. All of this is guaranteed in law and has been upheld by different forms of the Supreme Court. So I want to go through some of the steps so that we begin to understand how this differs from other racial and ethnic groups. There are currently 562 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Federal recognition establishes a government-to-government relationship between the federal government and the tribe. In other words, part of what we see here is that as tribes are recognized, this is that it sets up a situation in which they are recognized almost as if they were a foreign government, and that there should be liaisons between the tribes and the federal government. Federally recognized tribes are eligible for federal assistance programs that fund initiatives like schools and health clinics on their lands, which are sometimes held in trust by the U.S. government and are exempt from state and local jurisdiction. That's what's really, really important there. That last line that says exempt from state and local jurisdiction is that historically there have been a lot of skirmishes between counties and states trying to either take tribal lands or to uphold different laws or to pass different laws that apply to these tribes. And because of their tribal recognition, it's important to note that they are not subject to state laws or these types of things. So, for example, in the state of California, where we see this play out is in casinos. People have asked why casinos are allowed on tribal lands. It's because it's up to the tribe to govern what particular businesses, what particular practices are allowed. The state cannot regulate that. Then we have tribal sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty refers to tribes' rights to govern themselves, define their own membership, manage tribal property, and regulate tribal business and domestic relations. It further recognizes the existence of a government-to-government relationships between such tribes and the federal government. Federally recognized tribes are considered domestic dependent nations. In your reading of Ome and Wanat a few weeks ago, we talked about this as nation within a nation status. In other words, that they are identified as sovereign nations within the borders of the United States. And so part of what's important to note here is that when we talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline, part of what's happening here is really a collision between who regulates the lands and who manages the lands, and where does the tribal property start or begin. So with the Standing Rock Sioux, for example, we see that they are arguing that their lands, that the lands in which they're drilling through in terms of the pipeline, actually go through sacred grounds, which should fall under tribal sovereignty. Others have argued that it's actually not, that those lands, since they're not formally part of the reservation, are not subject to those particular ideas. So part of what we want to think about and what really complicates the issue in terms of the Standing Rock Sioux and the Dakota Access Pipeline is how sovereignty works, how the United States must deal with the Standing Rock Sioux, and also how private corporations must need to deal with tribal sovereignty. The other thing to think about in terms of tribal sovereignty, in terms of how we think about managing defining their own membership, is that each tribe has the right to decide who is their membership. Now, we've heard, if you do a quick internet search, that each tribe may decide based on blood quantum who belongs. Meaning it could be 1/16th, meaning that one of your grandparents has to at least be a full Native American or a full member of that tribe. Some have used 1/32nd, which is one of your great grandparents. Others have brought it down to 1/8. And so there have also been internally to the tribes a lot of conflict over who belongs and who doesn't. But again, at the end of the day, it is up to the tribe to make these decisions. So tribal sovereignty has been guaranteed by what has been referred to as the Marshall Trilogy. And so Marshall, and the Supreme Court in particular, basically had three very key decisions that set up tribal sovereignty, and that the Supreme Court uses as sort of their precedent for trying to decide any Supreme Court case that comes before them regarding Native Americans. There are sort of three bedrock principles that underline these particular decisions. One, by virtue of Aboriginal political and territorial status, Indian tribes possess certain incidents of pre-existing sovereignty. In other words, part of what they acknowledge is that because of where they existed and where their lands are, that they actually have rights, that we must rights to land and rights to practice and that they can also assert their sovereignty in issues. So, for example, one ways in which we've seen this come into play are with museums. Many museums, for years, when construction workers were excavating sites and found remains or found Native American pottery, they would actually put that stuff on display. And so part of what the Supreme Court decided is that that is actually, in fact, the ancestral possessions of the tribe, and therefore it needed that things could only be displayed um, if, in fact, it was okayed by that First Nation, by that Native American tribe. Two, the second principle is that such sovereignty was subject to diminution or elimination by the United States and not by individual states. And so part of what this gets at is that it's really the U.S. as a nation and in conversation with the native tribes that can make decisions. State governments could not impose arbitrary rules. So in other words, it talks about the fact that the relationship with the tribes happens at the national level, not at the state or local level. And then the third general principle is that tribes limited inherent sovereignty and their corresponding dependency on the U.S. for protection imposed on the latter a trust of responsibility. So part of what this means um, is that the United States should work in good faith to protect the tribe's sovereignty. This is a sort of very loosely written piece about what constitutes protection, but it's also why we had why we also have continued the Bureau for Indian Affairs, the BIA, and it's why that particular office has been so critical because it really dictates the relationships with the tribes. So if you look at the current administration, for example, President Trump appointed someone who actually really believes in states' rights and who does not necessarily believe in tribal sovereignty. So that can create a very tense relationship between indigenous communities. So these are some things to think about and to keep in mind some terms to think about as you're reviewing the Dakota Access Pipeline and how it impacts and how it impacts different communities.